Alright, so in this challenge, we're going to create a function that takes an array of numbers, and then we're going to return the largest number in the array. So here's a few examples. Given an array with the elements of the number 4, 5, 1, and 3, we want to return the value of 5 as the largest number in the array. I give a couple more arrays down below and the expected outputs from our function. We can expect that all of our values are either going to be a positive integer or a 0. So we don't have to worry about any negative numbers in this scenario. Down below, I've already started us off with our function. And then when we feel like we got that answer, we can highlight these test cases and uncomment them out and see if we get the results that we would expect. So in my first approach, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a for loop that's going to look through each item in this array and see if it's the largest item. And so in my first approach, I'm going to go ahead and set our biggest number to the value of 0. This is because we know that we can expect a positive integer or a 0 with all of the items in our array. Next, I'm going to go ahead and use a for loop to iterate through this array. And as I'm going through this array, I'm going to ask if each element is bigger than the previous element that came before it. If it is, I will assign it the value of biggest num. So let's go ahead and set this up. I'm going to initialize I to the value of 0. And then the test case is going to be as long as I is less than the array length, I'll go into a code block. After I go into the code block and execute the code, I will then take I and I will go up by a value of 1, making I the value of 1, and then using the test case to see if it's less than the array length. And so while in the code block, I'm going to go ahead and create a conditional statement, and I'm going to say if the array at index of I is greater than the biggest num variable. In that case, if that is true, then biggest num is going to be equal to the array to the index of I. And so we can imagine in our first case, we've set biggest num equal to 0. In our for loop, when we have set I to the value of 0, I is less than array.length, in this case 1, 2, 3, 4, we go into our code block. So array at index of I, currently 0, is 4. 4 is greater than our current biggest num, which is 0. So biggest num is now equal to array at index of I, which is 4. So now that we've done that, we iterate I by 1, making it a value of 1. 1 is less than the array.length of 4, and so we go back into our code block. So array at index I, which is 1, is a value of 5. 5 is greater than biggest num of 4. This is true. And so we go into our code block and we say biggest num is equal to 5. From there, we iterate I by 1 again, giving it the value of 2. 2 is less than the array.length of 4. So we go back into our code block and we say array at index of 2, which is a value of 1, is greater than biggest num, which we know is currently 5. This is false. So we don't go into our code block and we don't execute this code. So we take I and we iterate by it, and we iterate it up by the value of 1, making it 3. I is equal to 3. 3 is less than the array.length of 4, and so we go into this code block and we say array at index of 3, which is the value of 3, is greater than 5. This is false, so once again we skip our code block. I goes from 3 to the value of 4, and 4 is less than the array.length of 4 is not true. So we don't go into the code block anymore. Instead, we now return the value of biggest num. Let's go ahead and uncomment out our code and see what happens. Perfect. We get 5, 600, and 1001, just as we would expect. All right, let's go ahead and take another approach at solving this question. In this approach, I'm going to try to make the code a little bit cleaner. I'm going to go ahead and start with var of biggest num, and I'm going to set it equal to our array at the index of 0, our first item. Now, I'm going to go ahead and use that for loop again. But because we already have the value of the first item in the array, we can go ahead and start with the second item of the array as we iterate through our array. We then set our test case as long as I is less than the length of our array. We'll go ahead and enter into our code block. And after we run our code, we will iterate I up by the value of 1. And so now while we're here, we can do an exact replica of what we had before. As long as the array at index of I is greater than our biggest num, we'll go into our code block and we'll say biggest num is equal to the array at index of I. We already walked through the steps in our first example of how we're going to iterate through our array and assign new values for the numbers that are the largest as we go through the array. And so now we can just return biggest num. Let's go ahead and uncomment out this code. And we get the results that we would expect. All right, let's go ahead and give this one more shot. This time I'm going to try a different approach. I'm going to use Math.max, and I'm also going to use the spread operator. You may have already taken this approach as it's a very concise way to solve this problem. Let's go ahead and take a quick look at how Math.max works. Math.max returns the largest of 0 or more numbers. And so we're given a few examples here below. If we use Math.max on two values, 10 and 20, it's going to return the value of 20. If Math.max is used on -10 and -20, we're going to get back the value of -10. Now in this case, what we can see is we have 10 and 20 as these arguments that are being passed in. However, currently, we're working with an array. So how do we get this array turned into arguments? That's going to be where the spread operator comes in. Spread syntax allows an iterable, such as an array expression, to be expanded in places where 0 or more arguments or elements are expected. And so we have an example here in which we have a function expecting the arguments of x, y, and z. And then we have a variable called args, which is an array of 0, 1, and 2. One painful way to pass the values in our args array is to pass them in one at a time. So we could have a function of greeting, and we can have first name and then a last name. And we can return hi plus first name plus last name. Now, if we had an array of full name, with two elements, the first being Rob and the last being Merrill, how do we pass this to our greetings function? Well, we could say greeting full name at index 0, and then secondly, we could put full name at index 1. This is going to go ahead and grab Rob and pass it in for first name, and it's going to go ahead and grab Merrill and pass it in for last name, which should be hi Rob Merrill. I can already see right here in the original function that we forgot to create a space between our first and last name, so this might be a little crammed. Let's see what happens. Hi Rob Merrill. Great. I'm going to go ahead and fix our function really quickly. And then I'm going to pass those values in again. Hi Rob Merrill. And so that took a lot of code to do our full name array at index 0 and then type it in again for index 1. This is where the spread operator would allow us to take our greeting function and then we can type in ... which indicates we want to use the spread operator, and then we just pass in our full name array. And that's going to grab our first item and our second item as arguments to be passed to our greeting function. And the result is Rob Merrill. Okay, so now that we've had that overview, let's go ahead and solve this problem. We can simply return Math.max, and we know that Math.max is going to return the largest values inside of our function. Instead of having an array with the elements of 4, 5, 1, and 3, we want those all ready to be split into these individual standalone numbers. And so we can do that through the spread operator. That will take whatever array we pass to it and split it into individual arguments. I'll go ahead and uncomment out our code. And there, the exact results that we've got with our other attempts in quite a bit less code. Thanks for joining me in this challenge, and I'll see you in the next.